James Harrington, The Benefit of the Ballot, with the Nature and Use thereof, particularly in the Republic of Venice. The use or practice of the ballot has been very ancient in the eastern countries, and Postulus conceiveth that the Venetian use of the ball is the same with that which was of the lot in the commonwealth of Israel, and of the bean in Athens. Cicero himself doth give a very good account, and a very great encomium of the table or ballot of the people of Rome. And certainly Rome nor Carthage had ever attained to their grandeur and reputation in the world, had it not been for the ballot. By this only art, we had almost said, the Commonwealth of Venice hath preserved itself against the most potent enemies for these 1300 years, and it hath flourished in the greatest splendor of any state in Europe. Where the balloting is used, those states are most free from all factions and rebellions. There, persons of the most accomplished parts are advanced for their integrity and worth. There, virtue is as speedy a ladder to climb unto honor as nobility of birth, and a good man is as much respected as a great. Everyone giveth his election and vote freely, and that without the fear of great ones, or favor to friends, but according to the value and worth of the persons, do they give their suffrages. And for those who are of the most noble spirits, not for persons designing their own private interest, to the impoverishing of the public. There is not a place for pensioners, who are the burrs of a nation, and the succors, which hindereth growth of any state. They are very just in their rewards and punishments, which rightly laid do balance government. But by these means, their counselors are of great honor and wisdom, for mean men make it their master piece of credit to give venturous counsels, which no great or wise man would or durst. And princes usually find instruments more for their will and humor than for their service and honor, which never can be so in this state, for they ever prefer safe counsels with reason before rash, which only chance can make prosperous. Their management of their treasure is prudent, and their officers frugal in the disposal of it, knowing well that good husbandry may stand with great honor, as well as breadth with height. And certainly nothing doth consume itself like prodigality, which some by mistake call liberty. For if it be long used, it takes away the means to continue it, and consequently it does make a state poor, or else, to avoid poverty, its often enforced oppression, and thereby becomes odious. It is necessary, like Venice, for every state to have a full treasure, if it be but for the keeping up of its reputation abroad. For the power of a state is valued according to the fullness of its purse, rather than the largeness of its territories. The officers of that state are but few, and they make choice of such as are knowing. For being rich, they need not abuse the state themselves, and being knowing, they will not suffer others to do it. But in some monarchies, where there are such multitudes of officers, which is a great calamity, they serve for nothing but to rifle the prince's purse. And the fuller they fill their coffers, the more facile is their justification when questioned. Neither are they for making of parties or for debaucheries in elections, as it is observed to our great grief in 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 some other management of public affairs, or in some other places. There are no tumults or noise at their votes or suffrages, which in some places are so great, the strangers, hearing the shouts and noise they make, have conceived themselves to be at Ephesus. That state that uses it must needs have the greatest advantages against others which use it not. Neither is it possible to be destroyed but by another state which useth the same. Carthage had never been subdued by the Romans, but that the Romans used the ballot, as well as they themselves, and that makes us often to think that Venice, preserving her ancient rules and methods of balloting, must be immortal. Let's consider that anno 1508, when the emperor and most of the kings and princes of Europe entered into a league against her, by this one practice, how prudently she behaved herself against them all. We need not instance the prudent conduct and the management of their affairs against the most formidable power of the Sultan, which would have been a terror, if not a confusion, to the greatest princes of Europe, if we consider the Ottoman power and the continuance of those wars. And we are apt to conceive that by this art they have done more severe execution and given the greater disturbance to the Ottoman forces than all the princes of Europe, though all conspired against them during the Holy War. For by reason of their divisions, piques, and animosities among themselves, which by the ballot would easily have been prevented, they never effected any action of grandeur, organized any place, but to lose again. Whether the ballot to be so practicable in a monarchy, where all great offices and honors are at the disposal of a prince, and by him conferred as a reward of services, we must submit that to their pleasures, but certainly to that state wherein it is entertained, the advantages which thereby accrue must needs be very great, and would be the best expedient to establish monarchy forever, for monarchy can never be destroyed but by factions and divisions, which can never happen in that state where the ballot is used. Galgi, the king of Mindau, a prince who had many kingdoms and great dominions, being in a war, and for the better carrying on of the same, assembled his grand conciliado, or convention of states, for without them no money could be raised, which consisted of magnificos and populos, as with us in England, that is, of lords and commons. They being assembled, granted many royal aids to the king, but being continued together over long, they fell into parties, as great bodies are very apt to do. Some accused the most eminent ministers of state for their ill counsel and maladministration of public affairs, others opposing the granting of any further aid, affirming that taxes and impositions ought to be in the state as salis in a ship, not to charge and overlade it, but to conduct and assure it. The king, finding so many of them to be troublesome, the better to obtain his own ends, took them off by honors, preferments, and pensions. But thereby the king became indignant, the subjects miserably poor, and the great council broken into parties. Because others were preferred in honors before them, who, as they conceived, were much inferior to themselves in merit, and commonly the people cannot endure excessive fortune anywhere so ill as to those who have been in equal degree to them, and nothing begets more disdain than to see others go before them in the prince's favor, who come behind them in virtue and worth. The king, the kingdom being in this distemper, and the king encircled in so many infelicities, vainly a Persian, an excellent person, and a great friend of Galgi, advised him not to dissolve his great council, for in the juncture it might hazard his dominions and prove fatal to him, it being the great idol of the people, but to continue them during his life, and the better to reconcile all interests to cause 30 to be chosen out of the conciliado, to be of his council de Estado, or privy council as we call it, whereof 15 to be lords and 15 to be commons, and all those to be elected by themselves by the ballot, and out of the most virtuous and public-spirited persons amongst them, and every year 10 of those to be removed out of the council de Estado, and to return to the conciliado, or great council, conciliado, or great council, and by the ballot to make choice of their 10 of the most eminent amongst them for integrity and parts. King Galgi gave an exact observance to this sober council, and by these means he united all parties in his council, and there was such a due administration of justice in his dominions, and such virtuous persons were chosen for the management of the public affairs, that in the short time King Galgi became so potent and beloved of his people, for that prince who will gain their affections must give them ease and plenty, that when Badurius, king of Cambaya, invaded Mindau with an army of 150,000 horse and 500,000 foot, that prince, by the assistance of his own subjects and of some mercenary Persians and Zagathe, defeated and destroyed the great army. Certainly, as it was great wisdom in Vanley to give this counsel, so it was great prudence in King Galgi to follow it, for the great council consisted, or at least presumed to consist, of the most wise and sufficient persons, as all his dominions, the privy council, and others, the great officers of state, being by the ballot chosen out of the most eminent of them for parts and integrity. There must needs be rare felicity of government. There could be no complaints of the maladministration of the ministers of state, which usually makes the greatest noise, they being virtuous and wise, and chosen out of the ballot by themselves. Neither were they, who were advanced to honor, envied, which is ever an attendant upon greatness, by any of the conciliado, because they themselves in time might attain to that dignity in their wisdom and integrity should inworthy them, which has a rare happiness, for great men may secure themselves from guilt, but not from envy. And we have observed that the greatest interest of public affairs are ever shot at by the aspirings of those who deem themselves less in employment than they are in merit. Therefore, it highly concerns great ministers of state to keep sentinel, for every step they tread is paved with fate, and every misfortune of theirs commonly procures them as much dishonor as if they have been perfidious in their practice, and their unhappiness is deemed for a crime. Therefore, let those who are raised to the height of their greatness consider the prince's favors are always perilous, and that it's a difficult thing to stand long firm upon ice, and that the fall, how gentle soever, will never suffer them again to rise. But King Galgi, by his prudent government, had a peculiar felicity in his reign, and established his dominion upon the center of a flourishing happiness. Yet we cannot but observe one great solecism in point of state, in King Galgi's rewarding so many persons for being troublesome unto him. For that prince who does practice it shall find that no sooner he takes off one, but presently another gets up, and it will animate others to do so, when they find such encouragement for being troublesome. And at least it is, if the prince be notable, to gratify all, which is impossible for him to do, it may turn to the dissolution of the government. But certainly King Galgi could have no kindness for those persons he had so advanced, preferment being the reward of virtue, and not to gratify disquiet spirits, and the people, who are ever jealous of their rights, must look upon them as betrayers of their liberties, and the end of such persons, if one well observe it, is commonly very miserable, and the subjects never so much repine as their contributions, as when they observe them to be the rewards of persons to whom fortune, not merit, gives a growth. It was a remark of Henry IV of France that such persons who made the greatest noise in the Parliament of Paris were men of the least sufficiency, but they had soft tongues and hard faces. They did not vent their own conceits, but the projections and designs of others, and they were like hollow singing bullets, which usually flew but halfway to the mark, whereas the designer doth execution, but makes no report. It was afterwards observed that the successors of this great Galgi, not imitating his excellent arts of government, and neglecting the choice of the great ministers of state by the ballot, by reason whereof men of no sufficiency were promoted to the highest offices of state, which gave discouragement to others of more desert, and by the maladministration discontent to all. Thereby their country in a short time was overcome by Merhamed the Mogul Tartar. Whereas, if they had observed the prudentials of Galgi, and used the ballot, which had been a wall of steel to them, they had been invincible. There is no government but this of the ballot may suit with, if the prince and his great council please to make law for the practice of it, neither is it any diminution to the prince's dignity to depart with the conferring of offices whereby the use of the ballot all the things will multiply to honor, and the aggrandizing of his name. For many times it's as fatal to a prince to have had officers under him as for himself not to be good. The revolt which was made from Richard II was more for the displeasure taken against Sir John Bushy, Sir William Begot, and Sir Henry Green, etc., who managed the public offices under him, than against the king himself. For princes in the elections of their officers do more respect their peculiar affections and to serve their turns than the sufficiency of the persons elected, and more kingdoms and dominions have been overthrown by the ill management of officers than by the severity of the greatest tyrants, and the investiture of the meanest persons to the great commands hath often proved fatal to the greatest undertakings. For an instance whereof is that of James V of Scotland, who in the year 1542 invaded England with the army of 60,000 horse and foot, and was met with the Lord Wharton, then warden of the northwest marches, the battle being ready to join one Sir Oliver Sinclair, the Scottish king's minion, but of no great extraction or skill in martial affairs, was by the king's order proclaimed general, which the Scottish nobility took in such indignation that they threw down their arms and suffered themselves to be taken prisoners, there being not one man slain on either side, whereas if they had made choice of the captain general themselves by the ballot, one who had good skill in martial affairs, and whom they would willingly have followed, what actions of grandeur they might have effected, we leave it to the judicious to consider. The practice and method which the Senate of Venice useth in their elections by the ball may be read at large in Contarini, Gianotti, and Sansovinus, but in case these authors be wanting, Mr. John Ray's observations, printed anno 1673, will fully inform you, who hath, folio 157, exactly collected out of the said authors all the observables in their elections, which would be over tedious to express here, the same having been performed so particularly and excellently by the learned gentleman. We will here set down in a few lines somewhat of the practical part, for it is used in some cases with some nicety than in others. In great councils of state, we will mention the most facile here. The electors being assembled in some convenient place, as great hall, etc., the doors are shut up, and the prime officers who assemble or call together the electors keep the keys till the election be over. The syndic, or chief officer of for that purpose, takes the ballot box and opens it in the view of all the company, to see that it is empty and without secret conveyances, then placeth it on a table for that purpose at one end of the room, and calls such of the company as he thinks may make most dispatch, and gives to each a ball in the fight of the people, for a little ball made of fine linen, as at Venice, he puts into the box, either the affirmative or negative, and so departs to one side from the rest, and then he calls the next, and does the like to him, and so of the rest, till all are called who have voted stand apart by themselves. The box is somewhat long, and hath a partition in the midst, in which place 2 holes to drop the balls in, which are taperwise, broader at the top and narrower at the bottom. The right-hand hole is for the affirmative, and the left for the negative, and And because that no man shall know on which side a man puts his ball, who is giving his vote, there is a place roundish made in the box to put in the hand and arm almost halfway to the elbow, so as the hand being in, the party may let his ball drop as he pleaseth. When all have done balloting, the box is opened, and what is in the affirmative noted down. Then the next competitor is balloted for as the former, and so of the rest, and he who hath most votes in the affirmative is elected, and all very easily performed in a short time, without noise, without tumult, without animosities, and the most deserving always is elected. Finis.